Welcome back to Neon Liberalism. I'm Samantha Hancocksley. I'm recording this on January 22nd, 2026, so almost exactly 1 year since Donald Trump was inaugurated for a second time as the President of the United States. It's been a long year. A lot has happened. We have seen Trump's assault on the federal government in the form of Doge. We have seen repeated bouts of saber rattling or attacks on foreign countries. We are currently in the midst of the ramping up of ICE's deportation regime, the assault on Minneapolis, which we covered here last week with Will Stansel. So a pretty distressing time. But we've also seen a tremendous amount of resistance to Trump in the form of the No Kings protests, which are some of the largest protests in American history, in the groundswell of resistance to Trump in Minneapolis and in other places. So this week, I wanted to take a step back and look at this past year, what's happened, and just take a sense of the state of the resistance to Trump. And so to help us do that, I'm extremely excited to have on Omar Wasow. He's an assistant professor at UC Berkeley, a scholar of protest movements and resistance, and I think really the perfect person to talk about this. Omar, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
Okay, so I guess first question, what's the year look like to you? What's your overview of the past year of Trump and resistance to Trump?
So I would say broadly, it's been a pretty remarkable degree of mobilization in opposition to Trump and the administration's set of policies. And I think in the first few months, there was a little bit of shock, and you had a sense of people feeling like, wait, where is the mobilization? There was no equivalent of the Women's March, big mobilization kind of immediately. But evidence from a group at Harvard led by Erica Chenoweth has found that, in fact, if you look at the total number of people protesting month over month, it's actually been larger than it was in the first Trump administration. And then if we kind of look at the year in total, as you noted, there were these major No Kings protests and these sort of more local mobilizations of ICE have generated really fierce counter mobilizations. And that, to my mind, speaks to something that the administration doesn't seem to fully appreciate, which I think of as kind of the weakness of strong states. And it's like when a government, whether authoritarian or in this case, a democratically elected government, but using very aggressive tactics, kind of overplays its hand, it can actually generate a stronger counter mobilization that actually undermines their own policies. And so while ICE is clearly sort of a juggernaut right now, I think the other big story of the last year is that Trump's his popularity numbers, his approval numbers have dropped quite dramatically. And I think you can point to many things, but in particular, the kind of broad resistance has played an important role in that.
Okay. So I guess just to kind of address this head on, I'm sure I know people who look at what's happening in Minneapolis, who see, like you said, ICE as a juggernaut and are like, this is it. It's an authoritarian state now. They're going to cancel elections. Democratic politics is out the window, resistance doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. And on a personal level, on an emotional level, I understand where people are coming from when they say that. But as a scholar, as someone who's studied like the problems that authoritarian regimes or attempts at authoritarian regimes face, like what's your take on what we're seeing here?
Yeah, so let me pull back for a second and just kind of situate this moment in some of my own research in the 1960s. And so what I found in the 1960s, just to kind of give a very quick summary of the civil rights era protests that I looked at, was that, one kind of important detail is almost nobody directly observes a protest, right? And so protests sometimes are directly influencing like a local business with a boycott, but often are influencing the larger public through the media. And so what I found was that nonviolent protests generated typically sympathetic headlines about civil rights, and that media coverage moved public opinion in favor of civil rights and the Democratic coalition that was supporting civil rights. And that we saw that in elections, in whether it's 1964 or legislation like the Voting Rights Act. And conversely, violent protest in the 1960s had negative effects on public opinion, on media coverage. Media coverage tended to focus on things like law and order and crime and riots. And then public opinion shifted more to the Law and Order Coalition, which was the Republican coalition. And that helped Nixon win in 1968, right? So broadly, the story is protests can influence media, media can influence public opinion, and public opinion then changes things like voting and legislation. And so the first part of what I heard you say, and again, obviously paraphrasing other people, but it's a question I hear a lot too, which is maybe protests don't matter at all. Maybe nothing on the ground matters. And we just have a lot of evidence that that's not true. And so I think there's a kind of, in some cases, people being like really savvy, like, oh, like I'm the one who knows that like all this on the ground stuff doesn't matter. And in fact, that's not, it's not a mark of savvy. It's a mark of, nihilism or ignorance, but it's not evidence-based. Like there's just a broad range of evidence, both in the US and in other countries, that these kinds of mobilizations do in fact influence, people's neighbors, they influence policy. And so it can be hard if you're a participant in a march to feel like anything is actually changing, right? Because in any one march, that's not like going to move a needle dramatically. But the cumulative effect of a lot of protest really does seem to shape public opinion, and particularly if it's sympathetic protests, shape public opinion in favor of the cause, and that can then spill over into elections. So that's the first part. Protests absolutely matter and make a difference, although tactics matter too. And then the second part of what I heard you saying, again, sort of like, kind of raising the, good kind of skeptical questions, is sort of in an authoritarian, a semi-authoritarian, a semi-democratic state, like, does public opinion matter? Does voting matter? And I guess I would make two claims. So one is that the U.S. South in the 1960s is a semi-democratic, semi-authoritarian state, and it did, in fact, the civil rights movement broke Jim Crow, right? So I think we really do have, again, both in the U.S. and in other countries, evidence that these kinds of mobilizations, and this is not my primary of research because I focus on the U.S., but again, folks like Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephen have found that in much more brutal dictatorial contexts, mass mobilizations, people power really can erode the authoritarian state. So we have the great advantage of a much more vibrant free press, much more freedom of association, and I think it's people's pessimism about, well, will it matter in a particularly anti-democratic wave? I think the answer is absolutely. And while the U.S. may be moving into what's sometimes called a competitive authoritarian kind of state, where the idea there is you have elections, but there's a thumb on the scale is the kind of simplest way to describe it, right? So it's like they're not quite free and fair elections, but the incumbent can lose. And I think all the evidence points right now towards an unpopular incumbent. And even if Trump weren't unpopular, in the midterms following an election, the party that's in power tends to lose seats in the House. So history and public opinion data strongly suggest that the Republicans will lose the House in 2026. And even again, if there are these efforts to, gerrymander or restrict voting in some way with voting rights, or voter ID or something, that in a wave election, in a midterm, that our strong assumption should be, given the historical precedent, that the Republicans will lose the House. And so it can both be a competitive authoritarian context and the party in power can lose. And again, mobilization, like we're seeing in Minneapolis, plays a role in raising the salience of some issues. Things like, immigration is now something that Trump is unpopular on, where he was more popular, and that will spill over into elections.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in what
Yeah.
you talked about there. I kind of want to focus for the moment, anyways, on like one particular piece, which is this nonviolence piece. Obviously, that calls back to the civil rights movement, to their struggle against Jim Crow. But it was really brought home to me when I was at a protest recently. I attended a memorial for Renee Good here in Pittsburgh. It was bitter, bitter cold. We got out, we marched in silence to an ICE facility. There were some speeches there. We marched on from there. And while I was there, this was pretty much like a liberal organized protest, like an indivisible organized protest. But there were some people there who were clearly more leftist. And they were complaining about the protest, actually. They were complaining that we were silent. They were saying, oh, you're just being silent because that's safe, because that's not disruptive. Really, what we should be doing is being disruptive. We should be throwing bricks. We should be breaking into this ICE facility. Why aren't we throwing bricks right now? So I think some people have this, again, this, like, whatever, I've met people who have this kind of feeling like we need to be doing more. And what does more mean is more violent confrontation. So I'm curious, like, what would you say to people like that who are feeling that feeling?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think I need to begin with echoing sort of some of what you said, which is that you can understand people's rage, right, and that that in the case of a excess use of force by the state, whether it's a police killing or in this case an ICE killing, people are angry, and I have learned that the kind of way I sometimes speak as a social scientist, saying, well, the evidence was there was a 2 percentage point improvement in the turnout because of nonviolent protest, doesn't speak to people's anger. And so I think just kind of it's important to start with the human experience of somebody was killed. It was a terrible tragedy. And that we can appreciate that people, whether it's George Floyd or Renee Good, that people are in a state of profound. I don't know. Sometimes it's rage, sometimes it's grief, but there's a lot of emotions at play, and the kind of rational, tactical, what strategic sort of logic doesn't necessarily speak to that experience. So that's one thing. Second thing I would say is this is a classic issue in movements, right? There's a radical faction, there's a more moderate faction. Those, kind of groups are driven by different kind of ideas, often different personalities, and that is to say sort of leaders. And it's, whether you're looking at ACT UP in fighting for dignity with people with AIDS, or disability rights movements, or or the civil rights era, it's just these are canonical issues, right? So that's it's also to be expected at some level, and so I don't mean to minimize that tension, but it's a classic pattern. And so then how might I respond if I were on the ground with you? Drawing on some of Martin Luther King's rhetoric, I might talk, or one of the key advisors to King, Bayard Rustin, is that I think it's important to appreciate how militant nonviolent resistance can be, and that people sort of equate radical with more disruptive or radical with violent, and that in fact what we see in the cases of some of these protests in Minneapolis is that people are peaceful protesters being attacked by the state quite aggressively, and that takes an enormous amount of discipline to put yourself on the line like that. And so there's a militancy to that, right? And even as you noted, in bitter cold, right? I mean, to go out in these freezing temperatures requires an enormous level of discipline. So I think there's a kind of conflation of something that feels more norm breaking with militancy, and I don't think That's right. And then the last thing I might say is, which is sort of the other end of the continuum from like, hey, we have these feelings, is like, what's going to work? What's practical? What is strategic? And there, a range of evidence suggests that what you're trying to do, politics is fundamentally about building coalitions, and that norm breaking tactics often alienate potential allies to your coalition. Right. And by norm breaking here, I want to not be too narrow about that. Right. Like, there are lots of things that are norm breaking, walking in the street or something. And that's not what I'm talking about. But, your idea of, should we throw bricks through ICE's window? Those kinds of tactics, you've got a lot of people sitting on the fence who are watching the movement and debating whether they're going to like align with it or not. Are they going to join a protest or not? Are they going to vote with that coalition or not? And what's in some ways the most powerful kind of tactic, again, this is a lesson from the 1960s, is to be a target of violence by the state. That those kinds of images, particularly when they're documented in photographs or video, do a lot to build sympathy in the mass public. And I'm just going to say, let me add one more detail there. So the media really pays attention to violence, right? So the kind of cliche in the media world, right? It's like nobody covers a plane that lands safely. They cover plane crashes, right? So a peaceful protest, as you were describing, has the big disadvantage, consistent with the more disruptive faction, that it doesn't generate a lot of media attention, right? A peaceful protest is in some ways a plane that lands. And conflict and violence, those generate headlines. But what you want are sympathetic headlines. And so when you've got this coverage of ICE officers, paintballing a cleric at, point blank range, not paintballing, but, like shooting a non-lethal weapon at point blank range, those kinds of images are high conflict. So the media is interested in them, and they produce very sympathetic kind of small morality plays in the larger public to build a kind of story of who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. And so, I think the kind of closing thought I might have for that, radical flank in your midst is there are ways to combine militancy and a desire to do something disruptive, but it's by making yourself the target of violence, not by being the agent of violence.
Yeah, I believe Dr. King said we need to confront physical force with soul force. And, I had on Will Stansel last week, and he's talked about his activism in Minneapolis and about you can be very confrontational with ICE, right? You can follow them around, you can document what they're doing, you can tell them what kind of people they are, while remaining nonviolent, while, like you say, remaining like within the norm, like presenting yourself as like a normal person. So I think that's absolutely true. But I want to take a step back and ask you kind of about this broader question of tactics, right? Of tactical analysis, because I think a lot of people have this idea that protests are spontaneous, right, and natural, and they just happen in a certain way, and how else could they possibly happen? But when you look in the broader perspective, there are a lot of different ways to protest and to resist, and right across time and place and history and the world, people have resisted in very different ways. Some of these have been more effective, some of these have been less effective. And so I guess my question for you is, like, what's your tactical analysis of the the resistance to Trump so far?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I should here lean on other people's work a little more than my own. I have focused very specifically on, nonviolent and violent tactics as a kind of core question, and it's an important one. But some of the cross-national work really talks about a much broader, as you're noting, repertoire of resistance. And so things like strikes and boycotts and work slowdowns. And there's a really broad array of other kinds of ways of signaling, like what Gandhi would call non-cooperation, right? That like the status quo is not acceptable, and we are not going to pretend that it is acceptable, and we are going to engage in non-cooperation with the status quo. So I know there is an effort happening like that in Minneapolis, and that a broad range of institutions are saying, like, we're not going to be, we are going to participate in this kind of strike. And again, what matters, I mean, I think what can be hard in any given event is to sort of say, like, how does this add up to anything? And what the cumulative effect of a strike, and I mean, let me draw an analogy and then come back to your question, right? So a lot of social movements, to my mind, operate a bit like a standing ovation. So it's what's sometimes called a cascade model. And so you can think of a moment where the curtain comes down and the entire room is asking itself, am I going to stand up or not? And if somebody at the front of the room stands up, then people near them start to stand up, and it can just sort of cascade through the entire room to the back. But you're also paying attention not just to the people at the front of the room, but the people right next to you. So if nobody right next to you stands up, maybe you don't stand up, right? And the people at the front of the room are these particularly high profile individuals, maybe a celebrity, maybe an institution that says, I'm going to participate. And the people right next to you in the back might be more like your neighbors, right? But all of that matters. And so in something like a strike, or in something like this video of Renee Good being shot, like you're seeing a signal sent to not just Minneapolis, but the entire country of, there's this moment of, are you going to stand up or not? And over time, what we've seen is that it sort of tends to spread, if it can maintain a certain kind of image of this is a sympathetic cause, it can spread to more and more people, many of whom are not activists. We've seen some amazing video out of Minneapolis of people saying, I never go to protests, but I'm just so outraged, right? And that's the cascade spreading. And so coming back to your question about other tactics, something like a strike where a museum closes might not seem in and of itself like much, but that sort of normie mainstream institution saying we are going to participate in this strike is a signal to other, middle of the road folk that this is we're welcome here. We belong here too. So that I think really does matter to have this kind of broad repertoire. And I think one of the places where the U.S. probably could learn more from the rest of the world is around these kind of tactics of broad non-cooperation. We're not going to shop more. We're not going to support certain kinds of industries. We're going to try and do work slowdowns. And I think one of the challenges in the U.S. is we're such a big country that you can't have a million people come to the town square. It's always going to be 10,000 in LA and 10,000 in Dallas or something.
No, I mean, I think that's certainly worth bearing in mind, right? Even a country like Hungary that is a competitive authoritarian country is, compared to the United States, tiny, right? Yeah. It has one major city that is the capital and also the economic center and also the largest population center, right? Like South Korea had these huge protests. South Korea is a very large country, a larger country, but again, compared to the United States, just geographically, demographically kind of tiny. But I getting sidetracked here. Really, what I want to ask you about is the kinds of tactics that we've seen used in the resistance this past year. Because, to go back to Minneapolis, about 5 years ago, there was another murder in Minneapolis, the murder of George Floyd, right? And that touched off enormous nationwide protests that in many ways had a different character than we're seeing today. It touched off, in some cases, riots. We know there was a police station burned down, could go on and on about this stuff. But it's interesting to me that it's literally the same city. The places aren't even that far apart. We've had armed agents of the state murder somebody, and the response has been very different in both cases. So I guess I'm curious about how did we get here from there? Why did things happen differently then? Like, did they work back then? Like, I'm kind of curious what your take on this comparison is.
Yeah, I mean, there will be dissertations comparing, 2020 and 2026. It is remarkable that Floyd and Good are killed. I think it's a mile and a half apart or something, right? And these are just like national moments of reckoning. And yes, I mean, going back to one of your first questions, like there is a degree to which these things are quite spontaneous and chaotic and they're leaderless. And like that can be both a source of strength and a real challenge because any one person can, define the movement by their rogue action. So, I mean, burning down the police station was something that, sort of the entire nation was paying attention to. In that sense, it gave the country a sense of how serious and how angry people were. And at the same time, it becomes a lot harder to say, look, this is a peaceful movement, except for this one thing, right? And so partly both on the state side and the movement side, there's a long history of kind of incremental learning. Each side is like updating its tactics, learning how the other side behaves and adjusting accordingly. And so I suspect at least part of what we're observing is a sense in Minneapolis, where people have been through this now in recent memory, of what may have helped their cause more and what may have hurt their cause more, right? So that's just, people update, people learn. The situation is also quite different in the sense that there's, I think with the Floyd murder, it was much more a kind of internal civil war. You have residents who are deeply angry at the police, and so it becomes a kind of within city conflict, and that's dividing in some ways. Whereas here you have the federal government, sending in this massive show of force. And so that's unifying for the city, right? I mean, even I was listening to a news report yesterday, and they were saying even people who are relatively pro deportation do not support this massive kind of repressive action by the federal government, right? And so there's something subtle about who are you up against and how does that unify or divide. And then maybe the last thing is just that, like, every one of these kinds of movements is having to learn specific tactics for the specific situation. And so here there's this like ongoing pervasive ICE presence, and that suggests a kind of monitoring and in some cases, like, how do we get diapers to parents who now are scared to shop, right? And so there's a different kind of mobilization for this specific challenge, and that may lend itself to tactics that look more like I don't know how to put it, but it's like a lot of it feels like this kind of underground resistance of how do we do things to support our neighbors without drawing too much attention to them or us, which is just a different kind of mobilization to how do we draw attention to excess use of force by our local police force.
Okay, so I'm really interested in this point you made about learning, but also leaderlessness, right? You said, well, anybody can define the movement by getting out there and burning down a police station, right? And like for some people, or I guess to take this back to the 1960s, right? There were like defined organizations, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Congress for Racial Equality, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There were like specific organizations that were like the core organizations of the civil rights movement, right? They had an internal membership, they had an internal hierarchy. They could say, like, this is what we're trying to do. This is the plan. We're going to go out and try and implement that, at least for a while. I mean, whether you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like,
no, that's right.
And we don't really see anything at all like that today, right? There's no like whatever, indivisible is probably the biggest thing, but they're just so loosely defined. It's about signing up for a protest on social media or like seeing something go by, right? And so sometimes it feels like we're in this era of what's sometimes called like horizontalist organizing or horizontalist activism. And there's a book that I really liked, I've been influenced by Vincent Bevins, called If We Burn, that is about, in his perspective, the failure of horizontalist organizing, right? He said, okay, well, you could do this thing where you generate a spectacle and you'd post about it and people would see it and they'd come out in the streets and it would generate more spectacle and more people would come out in the streets. And then where are we, right? Yeah. And so I'm kind of curious, like, do you think that we are overcoming some of the problems with this more chaotic model of organizing, or are we learning and adapting in a different way, or like what's going on here?
Yeah, it's a rich set of questions there, and
it's terrible. It's terrible when an academic says that.
No. I'm serious. I'm thinking about two or three different things, and so I'm just sort of trying to. So I think the first thing I would say is, like, you're spot on that there was certainly in the 1960s there are chaotic, kind of spontaneous protests, but there is a lot of organization, and in fact, it's essential that there be groups that are coordinating, because you don't have the kind of communications infrastructure then that we have now that allows for a large number of people to even know, where do we meet at a particular time, or how are we coordinating, in the Birmingham bus boycott, like, rides for people to work, right? There's you need infrastructure to make that kind of thing happen. And Zeynep Tufekci has a book, Twitter and Tear Gas, that I think does a nice job of laying out how one of the challenge, there's this kind of curse and gift of the internet, which is that it radically lowers the cost of communication, it lowers the cost of coordination. And so that means one person can post to social media, like, we're meeting at this park at this time, and suddenly 10,000 people are there and there's a movement that's born, right? So think of Occupy Wall Street or something. And conversely, it can have these sort of side effects where it's she describes in the book an incident where there is this successful movement, and then the people are in fact defending a park from development being turned into some kind of construction site, and the mayor wants to negotiate with somebody, and there's no clear leader to negotiate with because there is no leader to this movement, right? And you see some of those kinds of pathologies show up in other cases. You can end up with something that's so diffuse that it's hard to know, what is the agenda? What are we fighting for? So I think, another part of that kind of, gift and curse of internet organizing is also that it lends itself to a certain kind of slogan that works well as a hashtag, but may not speak to any specific policy demand, right? Policy demands are almost always going to be more detailed and specific than what works well as a hashtag, right? So there are a bunch of ways in which the internet has enabled more mobilization, but has also undermined our capacity to, I think, produce more effective movements, and that's a real tension. And at the same time, I don't know that I agree. I haven't read the Bevins book, so I will do that. But that just because it's horizontal and just because there's spectacle doesn't mean it's ineffective. And in fact, a lot of what across time has been effective are spectacles picked up by the media that help to shape public opinion. So just to pick one example that I'm fond of, right, ACT UP puts a condom over Jesse Helms's home. And by condom, I mean here a fake giant kind of set design cloth condom that gets lots of media attention. It's funny, it's spectacle. It's not violent in the like smash a window sense. It is, in some ways violating his property rights, but they make a point of saying if there's any damage, we'll pay for it. And so I think spectacle is actually like there's a lot to recommend in spectacle. And thinking again about this sort of like what's happened effectively in the last year, like in the Portland protests, these people showing up in their inflatable dinosaur costumes was like not only marvelous as tactic in the sense of like if ICE is spraying you with tear gas or whatever, like you're a little bit more protected, but it just created like marvelous images, right? It's like you're mocking the authority, these very repressive forces. And so it got covered by the media. It makes the protests who are being called terrorists, the protest movement who are being, attacked in this very aggressive language. It sort of belies or undermines that kind of rhetoric. And so that kind of spectacle, I think, which was very much bottom up spontaneous, that was not, that was not a coordinated effort, I think did a lot to change or at least to help shape people's perceptions of the movement. And right. And so I think that kind of horizontal spectacle can work. But to kind of agree with Bevins to a degree, if that's all there is, it can peter out or it can lack. You still ideally have some point of focus, which is like what is the goal here? Can that be articulated? Can other people join the coalition and mobilize around that? Right. So it can't just be spectacle.
Yeah, so that's something that I've often been very concerned with is this, like you say, on the one hand, we have a mass movement, we have a lot of energy, but maybe kind of a diffuse, like you're just not going to get, 1 million people to all agree on like your white paper. But then like, well, what do you actually do, right, with power? And I want to talk about that. I want to ask you about that. But first, I want to talk about spectacle, because I think that's really interesting. There's one protest that is, obviously, they were successful. They lodged themselves in my head. Are these kids who go into a museum in Britain with some cans of soup, and they throw the soup on I believe, a Picasso painting, and then glue themselves to the wall and take off their shirts to reveal that their shirt says like "Just Stop Oil," or something like the shirt they have underneath like says "Just Stop Oil," so something to that effect. And so there's a kind. And to me, I don't really know if this helped their cause very much. I think most people looked at this and were like, you guys are just assholes. You're throwing soup at a painting. Like a famous painting that's like good. It's not like a bad painting or whatever, right? So I'm kind of curious, like, what do you think makes for effective spectacle, right? Spectacle that actually advances your narrative rather than advancing somebody else's narrative, right? How do you create these kinds of good images?
Yeah, great question. So just starting with the Just Stop Oil stuff, like there actually have been experiments, and these are not, you're not literally like sending people into museums at random to do this, but they run online experiments where people are exposed to a news story about something like this. And broadly, the evidence is it does raise attention to the matter, and generally people respond quite negatively to it. And that, it depending on the context, like sometimes in there's no such thing as bad press kind of approach, like maybe generating attention does help to advance your cause. But I think the bulk of the evidence suggests that like getting people to have strong negative reactions to your cause undermines support for the cause, right? So like I think our intuitions are pretty good. There was one post on social media I saw after this where somebody was like, I'm very concerned about climate change, but whatever these people are for, I'm against, and it was just like, there's just a kind of visceral, like exactly as you said, this kind of feels like a very, like these people seem like jerks is sort of not necessarily where you want to be as a movement. And I should add one more refinement here, which is that people will sometimes look at the 1960s and say, hey, look, the white mass public was opposed to the civil rights movement. So how can you say this is about moving public opinion? And I think what's important to appreciate is that there's like a persuadable block of the public that is open to your ideas. And so it's not that you're going to move everybody to your side, The question is, it might be 10 to 20% of the people are persuadable. And if you bring those people in and you grow your coalition from 30 to 40% or something, like, you have more power. And I think, and one other kind of point within that matters is that there are elites, celebrities, politicians, bureaucrats, who are also very attentive to what's happening on the ground. And if they feel like there is both pressure and that it's a sympathetic cause, then they can align themselves with you and try to move, policy in your favor. But if they feel like the public is opposed to you, then they have to distance themselves, right? And so I think what we also saw in the 1960s was, like, yes, a large block of the white mass public was opposed to the civil rights movement, but the Democratic Party saw this and was moved, and enough of the voters in the Democratic Party were moved that there was a winning coalition for legislative victories in, again, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, right? So you don't have to move everybody. You just have to, like, grow your coalition enough to gain power enough to get things done, right? So that's one part of it. The other thing I would say is, like, to the second part of your question, and this is something I'm thinking about a lot, is exactly as you put it. Like, each protest is an act of storytelling. And so the question is, what kind of story are you constructing in the world, right? And again, I want to be clear, this is not my insight. John Lewis, really important civil rights leader, would talk about we're trying to dramatize injustice. And if you even think about the language of protest, right, we stage a protest, right? And so there's a kind of built-in understanding that this is a narrative act. We are engaged in constructing a story in the public mind. And so what I think the evidence from the 1960s suggests is what you're really trying to do is construct a story where there's, like, a clear, as much as possible, a clear bad guy, a clear good guy, a story of, where people look at an image of, young people being hit with a fire hose and they say, okay, like, I don't want to align myself with Bull Connor, right? And I think that's, in some ways, to bring it back to the present, what's happening in Minneapolis. Like, this is the Trump administration is engaging in such aggressive tactics that they are alienating a large block of that kind of more moderate, potentially even disengaged public that sort of says, whoa, I'm not down with that. And so this comes back also to your question about, like, why not throw a brick through the ice window? Because you don't actually, like, that may or may not, the story that constructs in the mind of the public doesn't really focus attention on the injustice being meted out on immigrants. But because the story that will come out of that is, some kind of vigilantism, and it sort of takes the attention off of what ICE is doing and puts it on the actions of the protesters is sort of, I think, the lesson of the 1960s. Put it in more technical language, you move from, like, a rights frame, right? Like is this constructed as a story about rights, to a crime frame? Is this a story about lawlessness? But the other thing is there's enough lawlessness being initiated by the state that, like, what you want to do is keep the camera focused on that, right? I sometimes think about this as, if I was an activist in Minneapolis, I'd want to think like a camera, right? Like, how do we get images of state lawlessness, state injustice out to the larger public?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Right. That I think there's this model of protest where it's like, okay, we're going to do something crazy. We're going to generate attention. And afterwards, we'll explain what it's about. And, like, that's just narratively unsatisfying. Right. Whereas, like, you need to create a situation where, like, the image, the act itself is the story that you're trying to tell. And, like, that isn't always easy, but it works. I think is the right. Evidence of what you've been talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
But I want to ask a question. So It seems like you're offering us a picture where, okay, we have activists who are generating these confrontations, generating this spectacle. But like you said at the outset, no, very few people actually see a protest. Protests are like, not observed in person, but they're refracted through the media, right? So we have this other factor, the media, and then that's going to transmit out into the mass public. And that's like where power is over in the mass public. And so we can ask questions about every part of that story. Mostly thus far in the interview, we've focused on that first part, right? The activists, the spectacle, the generation, the tactics. I want to ask about the media, right? I think a lot of people who are more left of center are extremely frustrated by the media today, right? That, you mentioned at the beginning that after Trump's inauguration, there was a kind of a feeling of like shock and dismay. And I think that was especially present at the elite level, right? And people in elite media circles were like, I guess I live in an authoritarian country now. I guess Donald Trump really was right about things, and I need to figure out how to understand why he was right about things, right? Ezra Klein, writes this kind of infamous essay, Charlie Kirk was doing politics the right way. Could go on with other examples about this. And so I think some people have this question, okay, like how do we get our message out in this kind of media environment, right? If the media is kind of like hostile to the kind of message that we want to be telling, if they're kind of more sympathetic than we want them to be to Trump and his policies, like how do we deal with that problem?
Yeah, so I mean, that's, I think, not a unique problem to the United States or this moment, right? That in the 1960s, there was a pro-segregation faction of the press. The non-Southern press was often indifferent to the interests of Black Americans. The only really crusading press for rights was the Black press. And so, and in other countries, you have, again, a media that is very state aligned. And so part of what you're trying to do with some of these, I think part of what's so powerful about what's happening in Minneapolis and the way people have mobilized in opposition to the ICE presence there is that when there was a survey that found 82% of people in America or adults have watched the video of Renee Good being killed. Right. But we just sort of almost take it for granted that there's a video. Well, no, somebody had the foresight to bear witness and document, right? Similarly with George Floyd, right? Like Darnella Frazier, 17-year-old teenager, is walking with her, I think it's cousin, to a corner store to do an errand, and has the presence of mind to not just document Officer Chauvin putting the full force of his weight on George Floyd's neck, but like sits there for 9.5 minutes documenting and doesn't let the police block her view and keeps the focus on their faces. And so these acts of bearing witness really matter. And they matter increasingly not because the traditional media does or doesn't cover them, but because, again, Darnella Frazier posts that video to social media and it, rocks American politics, now for many years. And so I think there's a kind of citizen journalist role that is very important. These moments of bearing witness. In the 1960s, like they would organize protests in the morning in some cases so that NBC News could cover the event and fly footage back to New York to broadcast nationally, right? Like they were trying to, or they would pick cities that had TV is quite new in the early 1960s. And so some cities had TV stations and some didn't, right? So in some cases it was like, what has the right combination of this, police chief who's going to engage in spectacles of violence and a TV station that's nearby. And so there was this real dependence on mass media, and that's just not the case anymore. And then the last thing I would say is like all of these, whether you're talking about elected officials or the media, they're all sort of at some level part of that, like in the auditorium paying attention to the cascade. And so even though people, for example, criticize the New York Times a ton, they did this very careful review of that video to sort of make a case that maybe this was an unjustified killing, right? So I think the part of what the movement is trying to do is both document acts by the state that are egregious, circulate those, and also invite and grow the coalition, which will sometimes include media that might not entirely be sympathetic, because they see this is just like a big news story and we need to be a part of it. So I think, hostile media is not new, and people have more tools to route around the media now than they've ever had. And so I don't take that. I mean, in some ways, it's almost like a given. You are a movement that is a kind of challenge to the status quo. And so, the status quo institutions are not on your side, and that's not a new problem.
No, I think that's absolutely right. We always have to recognize, in this game there is another team, possibly several other teams playing different games on the same field, but you just have to accept that and figure out how to make it work. And so I am actually but I do kind of want to ask that question, because you talked about the media landscape of the 60s, right? And CBS News at the time of, the March in Selma had more viewers in absolute terms than all broadcast news corporations put together today, right? And that's when the country was much smaller. Right. So there was a level of consolidation, a level of the big three dominating the nightly screens in a way that's kind of hard for us to comprehend. And like you say, we live in a much different world where everybody has a camera in their pocket. Right. Anybody can become a citizen journalist at any moment. They can get out there. They can put that video out. But that media environment creates its own difficulties. Right. It creates its own. People talk about epistemic bubbles or information silos, or, the perils of the attention economy. And I guess, what's your perspective on, how do we navigate this kind of new media environment effectively?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something I think about a lot, but I'm less expert in. But one way I think about it is that we've always been in epistemic bubbles, right? There is no... it's in some ways, to get a little bit go for a deep cut, right? Plato's allegory of the cave is a story of there's a prisoner in a cave whose only understanding of the world is shadow puppets on a wall. And when I first heard about this in college, I thought, oh, this is too crazy. I can't even figure out what this person is talking about, right? And what I now appreciate is that, in the 1960s, right, there's again, there's a pro-segregation media that when there's a protest, it's not a First Amendment gathering of people looking for a redress of grievances. It's outside agitators and a criminal act, right? And so that kind of, dual reading of the Renee Good video, some people see one thing, other people see another thing, is not new. And I think in some ways it's maybe a fundamental feature of human cognition, that we're going to have these pre-existing stories in our head. We all live to some degree in a cave looking at flickering shadow puppets and making sense of the world in this partial way, and to make it not quite so metaphorical, right? It's what do I know about what's happening, for the Iran protests, right? I get flickering images in the news, and so we all, and even in Minneapolis, I have exceedingly partial information, right? Someone like Will Stansel is on the ground and has a very different experience than I do, just kind of watching from afar in California. And so at some level, that's the nature of life. Now, what is, I agree, different now is there's much more media, and that means there's sort of it's got this kind of highly fragmented, highly I don't know. The word always comes to my mind is kaleidoscope. It's just this weird kind of so many different ways of seeing a particular moment are constantly available. So I mean, it's not that the past is exactly the same as the present, but but that epistemic, or that kind of like, that people have these different sorts of bubbles, is something like, I think, deeply true about life in general. And so how to respond to that, what to do, right? Like, what does that mean for the present moment? I think it speaks to why something like the video of the shooting of Renee Good is so powerful, even if 30% of the public says it was totally justified. What we've seen is that a majority of the public in many polls now says that was over the line, right? And so there's certain kinds of stories, certain kinds of images, certain kinds of video. Same thing happened with the George Floyd video, where even people on the right were like, whoa, that was beyond the pale. And so that creates a very high bar for a movement, because it sort of, you always end up with a, well, he was no angel kind of story about something where, like, the person who people are paying attention to is not a perfect model. As an example of this, going back to the 1960s, and I'm sorry to jump around a little, but right, in the last week, someone named Claudette Colvin just passed away. And before Rosa Parks, she had refused to give up her seat on a bus. And the kind of town elders were like, we can't have you at the front lines of our movement. But Rosa Parks was almost cast. I mean, Rosa Parks both had agency and was somebody who took a stand, but also was like backed by the community of activists to be the representative, because she was seen as the more angelic figure, right? And so it means it's like, yeah, there's a double standard, there's an asymmetry. It's really hard for movements to kind of have these kind of perfect victims, in a Renee Good or in a Rosa Parks. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. And I think, and when those moments come along, as tragic as the Renee Good killing is, it is also, for a movement, the kind of thing that really puts in stark relief the kind of brutality being used by the state against civilians. And that's something that helps elevate a movement and its cause in the larger public. And so, the lesson from the 1960s was, like, people are risking injury, they're risking death, they're risking humiliation, but they're doing it on behalf of a cause. And when people are martyred, that can in fact be obviously a personal tragedy, but good for the cause.
A personal tragedy, very much so. I guess so. I'm running up towards the end of time here, and on this show, I always like to ask people to not just look to the past, but look to the future, right? So we're 1 year into the Trump administration. We have 3 to go. I'm choosing to believe we have 3 to go. What do you see as the next 3 years? What advice do you have for the resistance in the next 3 years?
Yeah. So, I should be clear, I'm a social scientist, not a practitioner. And so in that sense, I want to be really deferential to the expertise of the people on the ground who are actually doing things. And so what I will do is in some ways draw on what I've seen and sort of say, like, that seems like a good example and that seems like a good example, right? And just to put this kind of in the big picture and context. So we sort of began with, like, how are protests effective? And at least some of that, right, is shaping public opinion, shaping voting behavior, and in turn, changing policy. I think it's very likely, again, that power shifts in Congress. And that means that the pressure from activists is no longer just going to be on the administration, but on the Democratic Party to be a more forceful arm of a resistance movement, right? So that's, I think, going to be one probable shift in the next year, and it's going to be, and it's going to be harder because going back to the analogy of like a fight between local citizens and the police force, and it's a within city conflict. This is going to be in some ways a within coalition conflict, but putting pressure on elected officials to to be to be more forceful is, I think, going to be both possible and nevertheless critical. I think one of the, it's hard to imagine. I mean, Trump's polling numbers can get lower, but there's a core of support in the GOP that probably won't ever change. And so he is approaching his, probably getting close to the floor of what's possible in terms of popularity. But we do see on issues like the ICE actions that even among Republicans, there is, it's not 90%, it's 73% support, right? And that matters. And so I think there's this challenge of continuing to tell a story that grows the coalition, brings in allies. And to be clear, like, there will be people, as the polling numbers go down, as the administration becomes less popular, in the administration who choose to defect, right? So that's another thing you see cross-nationally, is that part of the goal is not just to somehow bring down a regime, but to get the military to switch sides, or get individual generals to switch sides, or get just the police on the ground to not fire into a crowd. And so I think that kind of growing the coalition really does matter. So, I mean, a small example of that, right, was the Justice Department apparently asked people to, lawyers in the Minneapolis Department of Justice to prosecute Renee Good's wife, and six lawyers resigned, right? And like, that's an example of kind of like regime defection. And there was this, Trump appointed judge recently said that this Halligan, who was basically pretending to be appointed to a position, was not a legal. I'm forgetting what her specific title was, but bounced her out of this role that she was pretending to hold in the Department of Justice, right? And so like judges, lawyers, like that kind of broadening the coalition means that it's not just that you are trying to like somehow stop Trump, you're trying to grow your coalition so that at every point of power, corporations, right? I mean, again, think about something like the Jimmy Kimmel incident, right? Bunch of people cancel their Disney subscriptions, and Disney says, "Oh, like we have to take into account the voice of the mass public as well." And Kimmel gets reappointed. Is that like, in and of itself a major civil rights victory? No, but it's like, it speaks to that cascade. It speaks to how like a culture of this is not normal, we are not going to cooperate, can become something that's more widely adopted. And so that's a second thing, right? It's like you're trying to encourage defection. And then I think the kind of thing that I've seen on the ground that seems to me has been quite effective is this kind of broad repertoire of tactics, from the inflatable dinosaurs to the underground efforts to bring children to school, and I just want to, in some ways, just like kind of admire from afar the creativity and the civic mindedness of a lot of these actions, right? I mean, this is in some ways this kind of quintessentially American thing to sort of, there's a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, I'm going to butcher it, but like he's talking about comparing, I think it's France, the UK, and America. And he says something like, in the UK, when people have a problem, they turn to the king. And in France, when they have a problem, they turn to the church. And in America, when they have a problem, they turn to an organization. They turn to each other, right? And I think that's just this like fundamentally deeply American way of mobilizing, is like, how do we come together and like solve a problem with some kind of low, small, micro collective action? And so I think there's just like, and particularly in Minneapolis, where there's this tradition of both, I think, church-based activism, bringing in, immigrants, and other kinds of kind of civic mindedness, that the Trump administration might have seen a blue state and a blue city and not appreciated the degree to which they were walking into a deeply networked, deeply connected small city with a high degree of civic mindedness that could mobilize in a way that the administration and ICE couldn't fully appreciate. And so in that way, I think Minneapolis is a model for all of us of like, oh, how do we respond? We come together.
That's a really good answer. And it's been a great interview. I really appreciate the historical context. And especially the context of the civil rights movement. Right today, things look pretty bleak out there. I think a lot of people feel pretty dispirited. And we look back on the civil rights movement, and they've kind of been canonized, right? They've been brought into the pantheon of American saints. And so it looks inevitable. But from the perspective of 1960, nothing looked inevitable. Jim Crow looked unbreakable in 1960, right? And like you say, they were facing authoritarian governments. They were facing absolutely murderous governments in which they did not have democratic representation. They were not necessarily a particularly large movement, but they won. And so I think that historical context has been invaluable for me, and I'm really glad that you came on the program to share some of it with the rest of us. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.